Hey, it's nice to see faces on here again instead of Zoom. Welcome to the May meeting of the Squirrel Hill Historical Society. I'm going to have to come a little bit short because my printer wasn't working today. And apparently that's pretty common. Doing the upgrade windows, and all of a sudden your printer stops working.
Right.
So I don't have any notes where we work from.
Right.
But
That's what happened to me.
again, it's nice to see everyone here tonight. And we have some interest. First off, as always, I'd like to recognize the board members of the organization. We're an all-volunteer organization, and we depend on these people so much. We have our co-presidents, myself and Jim Hammond, Vice President and Newsletter Editor Helen Wilson.
We're back here.
Back.
Wayne, I just want to tell people that there's books back here, and George's books are here, and there's handouts that are free for anybody who wants them back here. So at the end of the program, come and look.
Okay, then we have board members Gene Binstock, Toby Chapin, Audrey Glickman, Jim Hammond, Tony Indovina, Stanley Klein, Todd Miller, Helen Wilson, Eveline Young. And again, like I said, it's good to see everyone here tonight. And we're going to try to gradually bring this back to normal. Really, we're going to err on the side of caution to protect the members and attendees. So that's why the spacing and everything. And hopefully the numbers, the COVID infection rate goes down and we'll be able to start building back up again. But I'd like to mention also, we're always looking for new members. If there's anyone who hasn't renewed or someone that would like to join, go to our website, and there's instruction on how to join the organization. It's very inexpensive, and when you join, you get access to about 20 years worth of archives, all the newsletters and whatnot that we've put out. So I think it's very interesting. It's well worth the investment. We have some interesting programs coming up. Next week, Tony and Davina will be, or next month, Tony and Davina will be doing one on the restoration effort in a Neil log house. If you're not familiar with that, it's over in Shenley Park. And it's supposedly the oldest domestic structure in the city. And the research is ongoing. And he'll be presenting information about, where that's leading. In July, then we have Eric Lige, Director of the Raw Jewish History Program and Archives at Center John Heinz History Center. He's been researching the family clubs. We're defining a unique fixture of Ashkenazi Jewish experience in the United States in the 20th century. These clubs had members, officers, dues, meetings, minutes, newsletters, etc. And what made this different is membership. Everyone was related. As usual, there'll be no presentation in August. And that'll be followed by one in September by Jaquay Carter. He's founder and the president of the Greater Hazelbrook Historical Society in Pittsburgh. So, that being said, I'll leave it up to Todd Miller to introduce our speaker for tonight. So, Todd, if you want to take over from here.
Thank you, Wayne. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Todd Miller, the program coordinator for the Squirrel Hill Historical Society, and it's my pleasure to introduce this evening's speaker, George Guido, author of multiple books about Western Pennsylvania history, including Neighborhoods of Alle-Kiski Valley, 30 Communities Full of Unique History. Over the next hour, George will tell us about the rich history of 30 Alle-Kiski Valley neighborhoods, some dating back to the time when the rivers were the main mode of transportation. Many are towns and villages that grew around the coal industry or other industries, and some, like Johnetta and Charlesville, have disappeared. Some are still thriving and others have been repurposed, but they all have a flavor and a history that sets them apart. George has always had a love of local history, sports and otherwise. He developed his skills as a broadcast journalist in high school while working for local media. He covered the first televised high school football game for Westmoreland Cable TV 3 and WKPA Radio. He currently works for Valley News Dispatch and other Trib Total Media publications. Besides writing books, George is a well-known public speaker. George and his wife Brenda, who's here with us today in the back of the room, Brenda, welcome. They make their home in Lower Borough. So without further ado, let's welcome George Guido.
Thank you very much, Todd, and good evening to everybody. It's great to be here, and it's great to be at one of these live presentations. I haven't done too many of these in the past couple of years, but it's good to be here, and so thankful for a nice turnout. And I want to say a special hello to everybody tuning in on Zoom tonight. I think we've all become accustomed to Zoom over the last 2 years plus, but a special hello to those folks joining us. What I wanted to do, I met Audrey at one of the book signings that we had up in the Trentham area, and Audrey invited me to come down, and at first I thought, well gee, you know, I'm talking in Squirrel Hill, but most of my books are on the Alle-Kiski Valley, roughly defined as an area, let's say up along the river from maybe Aspinwall to Katanning, and along the Kiski-Menadus River from its jointure with the Allegheny River down to the Apollo and Salzburg area. So we're not too far from here. And I get the feeling a lot of people I'm going to talk about this evening are folks that you've probably heard of and are very familiar with. I have 3 books that I've published over the years, over the last decade. First of all, one that is the oldest is Alle-Kiski Sports History. A lot of the sports that I've covered over the past few years, and we have Mark Willoughby. I have a couple chapters on Freeport sports, which he and his father were involved in for many, many years, and that's the one on the left. The one in the center is one I made in 2016 for New Kensington's 125th anniversary. I was covering New Kensington Council meeting the first Monday of January in 2016, and I was thinking about doing another book to follow up my sports book, and as it turned out, I was covering the meeting. At the end, the mayor of New Kensington, Tom Guzzo, said, and by the way, this is our 125th anniversary coming up this year. And the thought struck me, gee, I should do a book on comprehensive New Kensington history. And the most recent one that came out a few months ago, a few weeks before Christmas, Neighborhoods of the Alle-Kiski Valley, which Todd talked about. And I'll be more than happy to take questions and answers after the program. And I'll stick around, and anybody interested in purchasing a book or getting my signature on a book that they've bought, I'll be more than happy to stick around after the program. Promises to be very interesting, and I hope that all of you fine folks from the area here enjoy the presentation tonight. My book on the left that I mentioned, I'm just going to get into it a little bit, Alle-Kiski Sports History. What I wanted to do was talk about not so much statistics, box scores, and that sort of thing, but the stories behind some of the people involved in sports in the particular area that I grew up in. And for instance, Willie Thrower from New Kensington played for New Kensington High School and Michigan State. Willie was the first African-American quarterback in National Football League history by playing for the Chicago Bears in 1953. And a lot of the things that he had to put up with growing up. For instance, New Kensington High School, after they won the WPIAL, was invited to play in a bowl called the Peanut Bowl in Miami. And back then we had the Jim Crow laws, and they told New Kensington, hey, you're welcome to come and play in the Peanut Bowl game, but you have to leave your black players at home. And the New Kensington players, only 2 were black, Willie and Flint Green, and they got up and said, either all of us go or none of us go. And it turned out that New Kensington's Red Raiders stayed home. That's the kind of stories I get into, talking about people from our area. And the middle book, New Kensington, I'll discuss that a little bit, but the brunt of my presentation tonight will be on my latest book, Neighborhoods of the Alle-Kiski Valley. So let me start off with a name that I'm sure you're familiar with in this area, Schenley. Mary Schenley, named Schenley Park after her, and Schenley High School, and several other establishments and other particular portions of the community. Well, the town of Schenley is located at the junction of the Allegheny River and the Kiski-Menedis River, and that's taking place just, I'm going to say, a little bit across the river from Freeport. And the first picture, if we could talk about the distillery that made Schenley famous. Schenley Industries at one time, as you see here in this 1975 photo, consisted of 67 buildings over 60 acres. And this was right along, you see the Allegheny River on the left. They made distilled products there, basically Schenley whiskeys. And they found, back in the 1880s, aquifers just below the surface on the Schenley side of the river. And they found that the aquifers were good in distilling products such as whiskey, vodka, bourbon, so on and so forth. So that's how the Schenley distillery got started. And they thrived up until, as you might have guessed, Prohibition came through in 1919. So they had to, shall we say, make products for quote-unquote medicinal purposes until the U.S. Amendment to the Constitution dealing with Prohibition was done away with in 1933. But something interesting about what they did at the plant during World War II, as our economy transitioned to a wartime economy, they made a war alcohol, for lack of a better description, at Schenley. And it was a byproduct in making synthetic rubber. In World War II, we had a gasoline shortage, but it wasn't because of a shortage of gasoline. It was actually, we didn't want to use more rubber than we had to. We wanted to dedicate all we could to the war effort, rubber made for tank tires and that sort of thing. So that's why we had gasoline rationing during World War II. So they had a very important war alcohol being made here at Schenley. And after World War II, when some Nazis were captured, they found out that they had planned to sabotage the Schenley plant in the hopes of controlling and doing away with the war alcohol they were making. In fact, right across the river in South Buffalo Township, they had 4 artillery guns set up on the hillside just in case the Nazi saboteurs were able to infiltrate our society and especially industries like Schenley. I want to talk a little bit about Mary Elizabeth Croghan Schenley. She was the daughter of Colonel William Croghan, and he was related to his grandfather was General James O'Hare from the Revolutionary War, for whom O'Hare Township is named. Well, at any rate, Colonel Croghan was widowed at a young age. In fact, he was widowed twice. And Mary Elizabeth went to grade school, and when it time to go, as they called it in the time, finishing school, she was sent to a finishing school on Staten Island. And it turns out the brother of the headmaster of the finishing school, Captain Edmund Wyndham Schenley of the British Army, met and fell in love with young Mary. She was 15 at the time, he was 42. Now, this is a scandal that broke on both sides of the Atlantic. We didn't have the National Enquirer and TMZ and that sort of thing back then, but if you could be assured, if we did, this would have been a scandal of major proportions. They eloped over to England. And when Mary's father, Colonel Crocken, found out about it, he reportedly fainted. This guy must have had a lot of influence, because he went down to the U.S. Congress in Washington, D.C., walked in and ordered them to get naval ships to chase the ship with his eloped daughter over to England to try to stop that. It wasn't successful, and as it turned out, he had enough influence with the Pennsylvania State Legislature that they made a law about, young girls eloping with older people at the time. This is how much juice this guy had. He had a lot of influence. But at any rate, he got in a lot of, let's say, nasty editorials about Captain Shenley in newspapers, and made its way to England. In fact, Queen Victoria would not accept them for an audience in Buckingham Palace. That's how frowned upon this particular marriage was. But it turned out in 1850, Colonel Crogan reconciled with Mary Shenley and her husband, but unfortunately, shortly after he died. And Mary Shenley inherited so much property in what we call the Shenley area here, near where Shenley High School is. She dedicated property for Shenley Park. They also had property up in our area. They had property all over the place that they inherited from General O'Hara. Back during the Revolutionary War, when it was over and England surrendered to us, the U.S. Congress didn't have any money. So they gave the soldiers land in western Pennsylvania, which included an immense amount of land to General O'Hara that Mary Shenley inherited, and that became the community of Shenley, which is part of Gilpin Township. But getting back to the Shenley Distillery, it thrived for many years, and ultimately, as recently as 1974, they still had 400 employees there, and they had a $400 million annual payroll. There were over 2,000 people that worked at the Shenley Distillery at one time. Made Shenley whiskeys, brandy, vodka, tequila, and rum. And in 1981, the warehouse payroll of employees fell down to 140. And finally, in this photo, in November 11th, 1983 was the last call. This is the shipment of the last truckload of whiskey to depart the Shenley plant, and it closed after that. So this was the last call for the Shenley Distillery, an industry that thrived for many, many years. And the Shenley neighborhood is still there, and one of the few things left in the area. They still do have a post office, by the way. They have a number of homes there. This is the Shenley Railroad Bridge, which crosses the Allegheny River at the junction there. On your left, if you can see the water behind the foliage, that is the Kiski River, which everybody calls it the Kiski River, and to the right is the Allegheny River. Now, apparently, plans are to dig up the railroad tracks and make that a walking bridge. They're going to have a network of trails from Pittsburgh. I think there's some on the north side already that start off around PNC Park and go upriver, and eventually it'll go into Freeport and cross the train bridge over the Allegheny, and they plan on having the bridge you see now in Shenley as part of a network of walking trails. Next, I'm sure many of you have heard of Nellie Bly, and very fortuitous for us, just the other day they put up a statue of Nellie Bly at, I still want to call it the Greater Pittsburgh Airport, I'm showing my age, the Pittsburgh International Airport, where she's in the area where the statue of Franco Harris and General George Washington. But Nellie Bly was born Elizabeth Cochran in this house located in Cochran Mills. It is a very small town located in Burrell Township. I'm going to say it's like between Apollo and Ford City, if you can imagine that on the map. But right here is where Elizabeth Cochran was born on May 5th, 1864. And her father, Michael, he did just about everything in Cochran Mills. He was the postmaster, he had a general store, he was the justice of the peace, he was just about everything, so I guess you could name the town after yourself. So this was the town of Cochran Mills. And Michael Cochran had a grist mill, a sawmill, and just about everything you can imagine going on in that town. Michael Cochran, besides everything else he was doing, he studied law. And when he became a lawyer, he set up an office in Apollo, and he, Elizabeth and his wife, moved to Apollo. And this is the homestead they grew up in. It's still standing in Apollo. They have, you can see in the lower left-hand corner, some of you, the Pennsylvania History blue and gold historical marker, where Nellie Bly's childhood homestead was. Now, Nellie was admitted to what was called Indiana Normal then. We call it Indiana University of Pennsylvania now. But after her freshman year, her father died, and her mother had no profession to fall back on, so she had to quit college, and Elizabeth and her mother moved to Pittsburgh. And during that time, there was an editorial in a Pittsburgh newspaper. The editor was George Madden, and he wrote an editorial saying that women, this was in the 1880s, shouldn't bother getting into new professions. They were intended to be school teachers, nurses, and so on and so forth. Well, Elizabeth Cochran saw that editorial, and she wrote an editorial in rebuttal to George Madden. George Madden was so impressed with her in that editorial letter that he hired her for $5 a week, and he changed her pen name to Nellie Bly. So this is the house that she grew up in, and so many things Nellie Bly did. She was just a breathtakingly pioneer journalist. She was hired for a newspaper in New York City. And what she did, she got herself admitted into an asylum, Blackwell's Island Asylum, for 10 days. She got out and she documented the abuses to the patients inside the asylum. And she became a famous writer after that. She was in Mexico for a while, and she got back to New York City, and some of you remember the novel Around the World in 80 Days. Well, she took up the challenge, and she made it around the world through various means in 72 days. So she was able to get over there and get back, and she married a guy who was 41 years older than her. I don't know what this is at this era where all these girls were marrying these old guys. But Nellie Bly married a gentleman who was Robert L. Seaman, who had a plant, ironclad manufacturing in New York City. Well, as you might expect, Nellie Bly became widowed at a rather young age, so she took over her husband's plant, and at the time, she had daycare there, she had health care, and things that were way ahead of her time. She charged her employees 50 cents a month for health care that we pay, what, $400, $800 for nowadays, unless you're lucky enough to be on Medicare right now. But what had happened at Ironclad Manufacturing, one of the employees embezzled a lot of funds out, so they had to file for bankruptcy. Nellie Bly ended up in Europe, traveling into Europe. She was in Austria right at the time World War I broke out. So since she was over there, she communicated back to the newspaper in New York City, and she couldn't get out of Austria. So the newspaper editor said, hey, since you're there, why don't you be a war correspondent for us and report back to us as to what was going on over there. So it turned out she was the first female war correspondent in history. She eventually died of pneumonia in 1922 at the age of 57. And she had what we could consider just a normal-looking gravesite in the Bronx. However, in 1978, the New York Press Club gathered up their funds and made for her a, let's say, a more monumental sort of gravesite, a more fancy sort of gravesite. So this is where she's buried now. It was dedicated June 22nd, 1978 in honor of the famous news reporter Nellie Bly, who died on January 27th, 1922. And Nellie Bly has not been forgotten in her hometown. There's a millstone in her honor. This is in Burrell Township, right around where the Crooked Creek Reservoir is now. This is in honor of Nellie Bly. Elizabeth Cochran Seaman was her real name. They have her birth date incorrect on there, but at any rate, she is certainly not forgotten in her hometown. And moving on, that is Henry Ford, well-known businessman, renowned worldwide, and I must say I hold with disdain the anti-Semitic remarks that Henry Ford did make in his lifetime. But we want to talk about, he had these grandiose plans for an area called Glassmere along the Allegheny River, right across from downtown New Kensington, right around where the bridge is that unites downtown New Kensington with a little community called Glassmere. And if we could backtrack a little bit, there was a Colonel John B. Ford in Ford City, Pennsylvania, a few years before Henry Ford came along. And John B. Ford, whom Ford City is named after, found that the sand along the banks of the Allegheny River was conducive to glass making. So he opened up the world's first plate glass plant in Ford City, and he later added an operation in East Deer, which is familiarly known as Creighton. In fact, that started in 1883, and the glass plant just closed about a year and a half ago. But Henry Ford found out about this, and he decided that he wanted to build a plant right across the river from New Kensington. He had these plans to have a gigantic plant, and at the time they were talking about digging a canal along the Allegheny River through French Creek around the Meadville area to connect with Lake Erie. So you would be able to ship items made in the Pittsburgh area all the way through this canal up to Lake Erie, and in Henry Ford's case, get them to his River Rouge plant outside Detroit, Michigan. He was so serious about it, he did buy a plant, and in February 6, 1923, he traveled to the Glassmere area along with his son Edsel, who became famous for a car that was a failure back in the 1950s that really set the Ford Motor Company back financially. But Henry Ford and his son Edsel came to the area, and it was like you know, a famous movie star. Somebody came to town. They had a parade for him. They had newspaper editorials praising his efforts to get that plant going, because he had planned on hiring around 2,000 workers. And of course, the canal never came about. So Henry Ford did build houses there. They are still standing in the area of Glassmere along the railroad tracks right across the river from New Kensington, where the old Alcoa plant was. And Henry Ford, unlike most of these company towns, he wasn't going to build cheap houses for his employees. He built them nice houses. They have the famous Dutch roofs, and they've stood the test of time. They're about a century old right now, and they still exist in the area of East Deer Township, up around, you see in the background is Bouquet Hill, and in front of the railroad tracks is the Allegheny River, where he planned on building that plant. So there were several dozen homes there, and when Henry Ford closed the plant, since they weren't going to put the canal in, the homes were sold to private owners by way of an auction in 1933. So that's the people, you know, after Henry Ford left had. They still live in the houses now, and they've still withstood the test of time. Our next slide, this is a look at downtown Tarentum in 1936 in the infamous St. Patrick's Day floods, which of course came into Pittsburgh and flooded the downtown area. But this is what Tarentum looked like. And you can see the Allegheny River in the upper left-hand corner. The river flooded its banks as it did often in the spring. The damage was so severe in 1936 that the government and everybody else said something had to be done. We can't keep going through this year after year, especially with the severity of that and with the billions of dollars it did in damage in downtown Pittsburgh. So what they did is eventually create 16 reservoirs in feeder creeks and tributaries to the Allegheny River. And one of them is on our next slide. This is Crooked Creek. This is located about 5.5 to 6 miles from the Allegheny River. This is the aptly named Crooked Creek, and the creek was dammed up. The ground was broken for the dam in 1937, and Crooked Creek was called by the Native Americans Woak-Hanee, W-O-A-K -H-A-N-E-E, and it means a stream in large bends, is what the Delaware Indians called that. And in 1937, September 23rd to be exact, was the groundbreaking for this. And you could see on the left-hand side, the dam itself, they needed something like 4 million cubic feet of stone and gravel to form the dam. And you see the large, sort of like the headquarters for the dam there, and that is about 73 feet high. And Crooked Creek has turned into a nice recreation area starting in 1950. They've sponsored boating, picnicking, swimming, all around that area, and it is still popular to this day. Now, getting back to Cochrane Mills. Cochrane Mills was a victim of the creation of the Crooked Creek Dam. Cochrane Mills was flooded over. This is another, Cochrane Mills was flooded over, and everybody had to more or less abandon the community. They had grist mills and sawmills along the river, and they had an actual town that was covered up with the creation of Crooked Creek, but that has prevented, and with the rains we got over the last few days, we're very fortunate to have all those reservoirs, because I don't want to think of what would have happened to the Allegheny River. It's high enough if you've been toward the river in the last couple of days. But that Crooked Creek is one of 16 reservoirs that has captured the water, especially during the spring thawing season, that allows the Allegheny River towns to escape billions and billions of dollars of flooding.
The Army Corps of Engineers built it?
Right, the Army Corps of Engineers built that, and it was actually a WPA project under President Franklin D. Roosevelt. And you know how bureaucracy worked. They waited 14 days to get the permits. Finally, they went to Harrisburg and Washington, D.C. There was another snafu the day of the groundbreaking, and it turns out there were 140 workers that just stood around until they got back from Washington, D.C. with all the permitting. There's a big crowd on hand, maybe 2,000 people. I have a picture in my book, in my neighborhood's book, about the opening day for the Crooked Creek groundbreaking, and it was a big deal at the time. And again, these really have been saviors for property owners and people along the Allegheny River. But the victim was the town of Cochrane Mills itself. And next, we're going to talk about a little town called Barking. Barking is on this side, the eastern side of the Allegheny River, across the river from Springdale. Barking was a coal mining town. They don't know exactly how it got its name. Some feel it might be for barking dogs, others feel, and what's probably the case, there is a borough outside of London called Barking, B-A-R-K-I-N-G, maybe how they got a name, but it's tucked against the hillside across the river from Springdale. In 1935, it made Ripley's Believe It or Not. Because of the direction of the sun, they go about 5 months of the year without the sun shining in Barking. So they made Ripley's Believe It or Not out of it. So they live without sunshine about 5 months out of the year. At any rate, in 1816, the Bright family settled Barking, and they had the Bright House Hotel. This is for rivermen to have an overnight stopover. In that era, you had a lot of rivermen bringing minerals and timber from the upper portion of the Allegheny River. They would tie maybe 1,000 tree logs together and coast them down the river, and this would be maybe the final stopover before they made it to Pittsburgh. In Barking, they did make a navigation dam here in 1901. It didn't work out, a wooden dam, so they had to breach it, and they built this dam, which lasted from 1908 until 1934. They just had so many problems with it, they finally had to blow it up. You see in the photo, in the next photo, in 1934. And you can see the little town of Barking in the background. But this was the dynamiting of dam number 2. They did finally build maybe about less than a mile downriver, a more modern dam, which still stands along the Allegheny River near Harmerville, near the exit of the Pennsylvania Turnpike in that area. But those were the first two dams, and this was dam number 2 that was dynamited in 1934. And you see the town of Barking in the background. Barking, after the Bright family had settled there, the Allegheny Valley Railroad was built in 1855. It's still standing. And coal was discovered there in 1917. They opened the Oakmont Coal Company. And it just thrived for many, many years. And finally, it was all mined out in 1979. The Barking mine closed. Barking, they had their own general store, their own post office. It was just a nice little community of its own. They even had their own zip code, 15009. But the post office closed on New Year's Eve in 1979. And there are still homes there. It's down to about 18 homes in that area. And there's a small road that takes you from the Logan's Ferry area of New Kensington and Plumboro down along the riverfront there to Barking. And there's still people who live there. In fact, there's a gentleman I met when we were photographing that area that took place. He still lives in the Lockmaster's home that was built in 1904. Next we're going to talk about, and I hope we have the slide available, the Harwick Mine. This is an area, let's say on the hill from Harmerville and from that area. It's up on top, and Harwick is sort of a combination of Harmerville and Cheswick, is how it got its name, but they had a very successful mine there. It started in the late 1900s, but in 1904 there was a terrible mining disaster. As a matter of fact, it still ranks as one of the top 10 mining disasters in the history of the United States. There were 179 miners that died. There were 500 men employed at the mine. On January 21st, or January 23rd, 1904, ice was in the air shaft. We had a couple of below zero nights. Ice got into the air shaft and dust accumulated down there, and with the combination of the dust and the methane gas, and the methane gas had nowhere to go because of the ice, it finally blew up. There was a terrible explosion in the mine, and as we mentioned, 179 miners died. 2 of the rescuers, and in fact there were, just as you can see in this photo, dozens and dozens of rescuers that did their best, but it became a recovery instead of a rescue effort within hours after the explosion. But 2 volunteers who went into the mine died, Selwyn Taylor and Andrew Lyle. And hearing about this, and it was the big story on the news in the Pittsburgh area for many days, Andrew Carnegie caught wind of the efforts of Selwyn Taylor and Andrew Lyle, and Andrew Carnegie quietly got medals struck to give the families in commemoration of the heroic efforts of the men, and it began the Carnegie Hero Fund, which still exists today. They just had their presentations for 2021 a few months ago. There have been over 10,000 recipients of the Carnegie Hero Fund, and the first 2 were from the Harwick Mine disaster of 1904. Now, Harwick continued. The mine reopened eventually. They had another explosion in 1938 that killed 10 miners, but the mine went on. It serviced the power plant right at the Cheswick-Springdale border. They just closed it down a few weeks ago. It was the last coal-fired electrical generating plant in Allegheny County. Duquesne Light had sold it to Genon from Houston, and you know how these things go. There was 2 or 3 other ownerships since then. You couldn't even keep track of it. Genon sponsored a Little League team in Springdale, and one year the season wasn't even over, and they had new ownership of that plant. So I guess their uniforms became a souvenir. That's how, what happens when a lot of these corporate takeovers occur. But the plant just closed. In fact, until 1970, it was fed by the Harwick Mine. They had a dedicated railroad line along Tawney Run, T-A-W-N-E-Y, and they had more or less their own railroad. It was called the Harmer and Cheswick Railroad, and they serviced the plant right down from the Harwick Mine, maybe not even a mile, certainly not a mile and a quarter. They went right into the power generating plant in Cheswick, and right at the Springdale-Cheswick border on Pittsburgh Street, there is still the bridge which took the trains across the river to deliver the coal, if any of you are familiar with the Springdale and Cheswick area. and talk about the coal mines and the influence they had. The coal mines, as we see in number 16 here, there were not police forces as we know them today. The coal mining companies had their own police forces in these company towns. So you worked in a company mine, you lived in a company house, and you had to shop at the company store. And what happens on the weekends, let's say the miners had a little too much to drink and they got a little too rowdy. In the community of Curtisville in Westier Township, they had a jail, which again, there was no trial or anything. They just put you into, coal police put you in jail for the rest of the weekend or for the rest of the night until you slept off what you had. And they let you back out, and they still, as of a few years ago, had the Curtisville jail was still erect. I had mentioned my couple of other books I have, and one is the History of New Kensington, and right now you see a photograph of Stephanie Kowalik. Stephanie Kowalik was born on July 31st, 1923 in New Kensington. Her father was a foundry worker who died when Stephanie was 10 years of age. However, Stephanie's father's love of science conveyed to her. She eventually went to college and got a degree in chemistry from Pitt in 1946. She was sent to Buffalo to work at one of DuPont's plants. They were so impressed with her work that they moved her to DuPont's main headquarters in Wilmington, Delaware. And in 1964, what Stephanie Kowalik is demonstrating here was a polymer that what they wanted to do was make a heavier cord in tires so your tires wouldn't wear away so quickly. But instead, as many inventions took place, she discovered by accident the material known as Kevlar, K-E-V-L-A-R, and Kevlar, as we know, is eventually the material they use in bulletproof vests for police officers and others. So this is the inventor of Kevlar, material used in police vests, Stephanie Kowalik, and they recently, in 2016, as part of the city's 125th anniversary, had one of those blue and gold plaques that the State Historical Commission puts up along 7th Street in New Kensington, which was her homestead. But there's Stephanie Kowalik, the inventor of Kevlar. And our final slide this evening is a lady by the name of Pauline Rue Smith. Pauline Rue Smith was a young health and phys ed teacher in Bell Township, very small community near Salina, Pennsylvania, which is, I guess, along the Kiski River, maybe you could say halfway between Apollo and Salzburg. Well, at Bell Township High School in 1943, all of the male teachers were away fighting in World War II. They didn't have anybody to coach the football team. Before 1979, you had to be a teacher at the particular high school if you were going to coach football. But back then, they had nothing allowable but teachers. So they had nobody to coach the football team. The men were off to war. And the principal called in Pauline Rue Smith to the office and said, listen, we have 35 boys that want to play football. We have nobody to coach them. Would you coach the team? Now, I interviewed Pauline Rue Smith just a little bit before she died when I was in the midst of writing my sports book. And she said, for some reason, I told him yes. So they sent her up to Penn State. This was in the pre-Joe Paterno era. Bob Higgins was the coach of Penn State at the time. She had just graduated from Penn State maybe a year and a half before. He gave her some pages out of the playbook, so she at least has a working knowledge of what football plays to run. So soon, this became a nationwide sensation in the small town of Salina. The school, the only one in the country with a lady football coach. Soon, Look magazine was there. One night she said she arrived home in the driveway of the family farm, and there was a crew from Look magazine wanting to do an article from her. And in that era, that was before television basically, Americans got their news with weekly magazines such as Look, Life, and even U.S. News and World Report. So Look magazine did a story on her. The Pittsburgh TV stations, or the radio stations out there, all went out to talk to the lady football coach. Even Lowell Thomas, who was a national commentator, at his time he was sort of a predecessor to Paul Harvey, let's say, and he did a national commentary on that lady football coach from Pennsylvania. Alas, Bell Township did not win a football game. They lost to Derry 13-7, that was about the closest they came. And Pauline told me, I guess the other guys coaching the teams couldn't stand the thought of losing to a woman. But the main point was, and this is not the end of the story, by 1944 some of the male teachers had returned to take over the football team. But Bell Township was able to sustain their high school football program through World War II, as many others in the small towns, especially the rural communities, were not able to keep up their football program. And when they tried to regenerate it after World War II, they didn't have much success. But Bell Township, because they were able, under Pauline Bruce Smith's guidance, to keep their football program going, from 1948 until 1951, they won 28 consecutive football games, which is still a record among Alle-Kiski Valley football teams. So Pauline Bruce Smith, the lady football coach, is going to be around and be famous forever. So at this point, I'd like to open up any questions or comments the audience might have, or somebody on Zoom if you want to communicate to us. As I mentioned earlier, I'm going to stick around in case any of you want to purchase a book. I'll be glad to sign it for you if you wish. But that concludes this evening's presentation, and I want to thank everybody again for coming. Yes, Todd.
What industries, if any, have replaced the ones that went away?
Well, that's been a difficult time. That's been a very difficult time, as we all know, up and down the river now. Allegheny Ludlam in Brackenridge is still there, and they're still doing pretty well. But once the coal mines closed, these small towns lost a lot of population because you had to more or less leave the town to get a job. There's one town that's in my neighborhood's book called Johnetta, Johnetta. It was along the Allegheny River, sort of upriver from where Shenley is. They had clay mines there, so they had a brick plant, and they had a coal mine there. The clay mine and the coal mine both collapsed, and they had to shut them down, and they literally shut down the town. They took houses on big trailer trucks out of there. The people moved away. The other houses were just stayed there and decayed after a while. So it's been a very, very difficult run in replacing these industries as they shut down, especially the coal industry when the coal mines closed. Now, in some instances, the big steel mill in Homestead closed, and they put in, of course, the shopping mall on the riverfront in Homestead. It's one thing they were able to do, but many of these communities, a lot of it just died out. The businesses died out, and the people moved out to other communities where they could find work.
I have a question. Creighton mentioned that PPG had a big glass plant there. And eventually PPG had a plant, I don't know if it's still up there, near Meadville, Conneaut Lake.
Yeah, I'm not sure if it's still up there or not, because a lot of people I went to high school with started out working at Creighton. They were transferred up to the Meadville area. So I don't know if it's still there or not.
Do you know if PPG was influenced by Ford as far as making glass, to your knowledge?
Well, they did in that Creighton plant. My grandfather worked there for 35 years, shortly after he came over from Italy in 1913. They did sell, it wasn't just a Ford, it was to a lot of the automakers. In fact, I can remember as a young kid, you would see on the windshield sometimes, they called it the Twindo plant, T-W-I-N-D-O-W, in Creighton. So they not only sold to Ford Motors, they sold to a lot of, there were so many other car manufacturers back then. But yes, they did sell a lot to Ford and the other ones.
Okay.
The plant closed, like I say, about a year and a half ago. It was taken over by a company from Mexico, and they renamed it Pittsburgh Glassworks, PGW. There were about 180 people there from the time it closed in late 2020. But now their Iron City Brewery has taken over the glass factory. To answer your question, Todd, I think that's going to be very popular up in the area. Iron City Brewery moved up there they're not only brewing beer there, but they're going to have a little restaurant there where you can maybe sample new beers or sample fresh beer right out of the vats. So they haven't opened up that yet. They're going to open it up in the summer, but sometimes these can be repurposed to something which I think is going to be very popular up in that area. Anybody else? Yeah, Todd, yeah.
Is Vandergrift considered,
Yes.
so Illusion Brewing is in Vandergrift?
Yes.
What's the story behind that?
Well, that is a small craft brewery. They have, craft beer there. It's privately owned. Very small outfit, but it's turned out to be very popular. They do have a U.S. Steel plant, and U.S. Steel plant was taken over by Allegheny Ludlam. They have a plant along the Vandergrift Riverfront. Now, a lot of it's automated, so their employment numbers are nowhere near they had when U.S. Steel was there. But again, talking about the area trying to revive itself, such as Vandergrift, and they're doing it. They're trying their best. They have a group called VIP, Vandergrift Improvement Group, and they're having some activities, and some stores are opening up there. And as you mentioned, the Surgeon Brewery Company, they also have a winery there. That's what do you call it? A wooden door, Brenda? A wooden door wineries also opened up there, where they have wine right on the campus there. So they're trying. Sir?
Two issues you talked about tonight. One was Mary Shenley.
Yes.
Her grandfather was General O'Hara.
Yes.
And he started one of the first glass industries just at the point across the Ohio River. And there was a book written about him called The King's Orchard. And there is a street, a one-block street, behind the PAA that goes for one block that was named after him. The second thing is the Hero Fund. One of the recipients of the Hero Fund, their children receive a free education.
Yes. That's a good point. I'm glad you brought that up. Yeah. Yeah, their children receive free education. Yes. Sir, in the back there, yes.
I have two questions about Shenley.
Yes.
What is the population of Shenley today? And the Shenley Whiskey Company, what caused them to go out of business?
Well, I think there was competition, and they moved the plant into Canada. The Shenley plant was moved from the Gilpin Township area near Leechburg up into Canada. And again, they started to run into problems. And right at that time, in the mid-1980s, the population of consumers dropped off. They started to concentrate on people going to exercise clubs and that sort of thing. And a lot of the drunken driving laws came into effect now. So people weren't drinking as much either. Not that we want them to drink and get out on the highways, but to answer your question, that's what kind of happened to it. And the label, the Shenley label, their headquarters moved to Midtown Manhattan. And the people there knew nothing about Shenley, Pennsylvania, and that wasn't very long lasting there.
And then do you know what the population of Shenley is?
Well, Shenley right now, they can't have more than a couple of hundred people there. Like I say, they still have a post office. They were going to close the post office a few years ago, but some people in the community got a petition up, and I forget who the congressman was in that area, but politically speaking, it's very, very difficult to close a post office. You go to your congressman and you want to save the post office, and the congressman says, gee, I can do that, and look like a hero in front of the townspeople. So it's very, very difficult to close a post office. But it's open there maybe like 5 days a week with limited hours, but it still exists. And the postmaster lives on top of the place, which shows you how old this is. It's like the old-fashioned places. The store owner lived on top of his store and went down and played storekeeper all day and then slept there at night. Sir?
Who, in your opinion, was the greatest athlete from your area?
Well, I'm going to say one thing. Tommy Pipkins of recent vintage. He played in the 90s at Valley High School in Duquesne. He set the WPIAL scoring record and was an exciting, electrifying player. But if I'm going to say the best from the Alle-Kiski Valley, I'm going to have to say Dick Mojileski. Mojileski and his brother Ed were just fantastic football players. They led Harwick to the WPIL championship game. And Dick played something like 14 years in the NFL. He had the record for consecutive games played at something like about 180. And for a defensive tackle to be able to play that many games without getting hurt was really, really remarkable. But he played in the famous game in 1958 against the Baltimore Colts. And that game sort of like was the first of the Sunday afternoon football tradition that we all know today. At that time, in 1958, there were 45 million people that watched that football game. And not everybody, especially in rural areas, had a TV then. Plus, you have to consider the population in the United States then was only about 175 to 179 million, about half of what it is today. So to get 45 million to watch a ball game on TV was very significant. And it was the first time in football history that a game went into sudden death overtime. I remember Mojileski telling me when I interviewed him that after the fourth quarter was over, the score was tied, and the captains of the teams were called out in the middle of the field, and they didn't know what to do. This has never happened before. So they had to redo the coin toss. Baltimore was a visiting team in Yankee Stadium. They did the coin toss, and finally Baltimore won the football game 23-17 in overtime. A very interesting story about that game. It was, again, televised. People around the country were watching pro football for the first time because college football was tops in popularity at the time. So as Baltimore was threatening to score, which would have ended the game immediately, all of a sudden the TV screens around the country went blank. Something had happened in the control truck. Couldn't find out what it is. So the producer wanted to delay the game because the whole country was going to miss the final part of the game. So what NBC did, got an employee of theirs to go running out on the field while they were lining up for the next play. And everybody thought some drunk had come on the field and was trying to disrupt play. And he was running around, and the cops were out there trying to catch him. And finally they discovered that just somebody pulled out a plug in the control truck. So they put the plug back in, the football game resumed, and they were able to have what became a famous football game after that. Yeah, that guy should have been the hero of the game. He probably got arrested for running out onto the field.
The championship game.
Yeah, it was the NFL championship game. Yeah, and Johnny Unitas, and that was a game that kind of made Johnny Unitas famous. Not that he wasn't regarded as a good player before, but the way he led the team. There was never, for those of you who follow football, the 2-minute drill when the losing team, and Ben Roethlisberger did it 50 times maybe. You use the last 2 minutes of the game to throw the ball on the sideline so you go out of bounds and it stops the clock, and you try to get as many plays in. But the term 2-minute drill was never used until Johnny Unitas took his team down the field, tied the game in regulation, and they had to go into that overtime. So again, that one game also was the start of the term the 2-minute drill. But going back to what you said, I'm going to say Dick Mojileski was maybe the most famous athlete in the area.
By the way, you have a great voice.
Thank you very much.
I'm not surprised that you're a broadcaster.
Thank you. Yeah, I appreciate that.
So I have a question from the Zoom control
Yes.
center. The question is, since they can't buy your books here tonight, are they available online or in the community?
Yes. Online, it's available at my publisher's site, wordassociation.com. 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 Have all the information you want to know about my books, particularly the New Neighborhoods book. And tell the Zoom person thanks for tuning in. And Audrey has a book through Word Association too.
Thank you. Yes, pockets.
And I should have worn my white jacket that has like about 10 pockets in it. I should have done that in honor of your presence tonight. Well, how about you? How many pockets do you have?
I got 4 pockets in the pants and 2 big pockets in the jacket.
Good.
Thank you, George.
Sure thing, Audrey. All right.
Did you, do you have a, did you go to college as a journalist?
If you want to know the truth, no. When I was in high school, we had a guidance counselor at Burrell, Mr. Hatchell. and he knew I wanted to go into broadcasting. So, turns out, he said this broadcasting school in Pittsburgh in the lawyers building down there across from where Kaufman's was, they had a broadcasting school that they were taking high school juniors. So I went to broadcasting school at night and I went to Burl in the daytime. And how I got started, the guy had a cable TV station in New Kensington, Sam Buffone. They wanted to do, was getting toward the end of the basketball season, there were two big games, and they obviously only had one crew, so they're going to do one game. The guy happened to be talking to my father. He said, boy, I wish I could find a fourth broadcaster so I can do a second game Friday night. And my dad said, wait a minute, my son's going to broadcasting school. So the TV station guy said, you tell him to be such and such a place at such and such time Friday night. And that's how I got started. And I started getting more and more gigs. And I said, well, you know what, I'm going to take, what do the kids call it now, an off year or something?
Gap year.
The gap year. That's a term I'm looking for. I just interviewed a softball player from Fox Chapel High School today that's contemplating a gap year next year. But so I figured, you know what, I'll save up some money and go off to college. But it turned out I started moving up the company. So next thing you know, I'm saying to myself, do I want to quit and go away to college for 4 years and start back at the bottom rung of the ladder when I came back with the company? So I figured, well, I'll just stick around, and it's pretty much worked out for me. But yeah, a lot of people are surprised. That's a very, very little known fact.
Have you ever worked with Sam Vidnovic from McKeesport?
No, but I knew him. I knew him because once in a while we would be covering the same game that he was, for our station. So yeah, boy, you talk about a legend. He was indeed such a legend in the McKeesport area. And he had quite a following. All right. Well, again, thank you so much for coming. We'll stick around.